Hi everyone, welcome back to Elevate English. As promised, this episode is dedicated to the context section of the exam, which is being phased out after 2016. Context is often considered one of the trickiest sections of the exam, and a lot of students don't normally know how to tackle it. The very first thing to remember is that if you're feeling stressed out by it, so is everyone else. Try and look at it less as the section which has the least structure, and instead as the section which has the most freedom in your writing. You have a lot of flexibility. You're allowed to write a persuasive response in which you convince the reader of a point of view, a creative response in which you write a story that incorporates the context prompt, or even an exposition, which can be considered a sort of debate that includes factual, logical, statistical, or anecdotal evidence while still answering the prompt and utilizing the prescribed text. Essentially, though, you're showcasing that you truly understand your chosen text and that you can effectively respond to the prompt while referring to it in an appropriate manner. Let's really unpack each of these three styles of context response. The first one is persuasive response. This style of context essay is very similar to the text response section of the exam, but with the ability to throw in more evidence from outside sources, which will bolster your argument. If you can think of any studies or philosophies which support your argument, bring them into your essay in a manner which supports your argument without completely getting off track. You've also got a lot of freedom here because there's not a prescribed structure that's needed for this section. That means that you can also do a creative response. A creative response can be the best or the worst choice, and it all depends on you. Even if you are comfortable writing short stories, this is slightly different. The reason it's different is because you are required to incorporate the elements of your context into a narrative and to create a compelling and interesting story. Even though it's able to have a different setting and doesn't have to mention the book you're studying in great detail, it must cover the same issues and still address the question. When it's done right, it often receives fantastic scores. The third type is an expository response. The expository response is more of a discussion with the reader. It uses the question and prompt as a springboard for building ideas. Basically, you're trying to show the reader a point of view, but instead of drawing specifically on one text, you can talk about it in a broader sense by using outside evidence and arguments. Once again, as with the persuasive piece, there's no clear structure necessary, so you've got quite a lot of freedom in this section. The difference to the persuasive piece is that you don't need to implicitly agree or disagree with the prompt. Your job here is not to convince the reader of a point of view, but rather to show them that you've understood all angles of the prompt or issue. I'm going to tackle each of the context areas of study by responding with a popular movie instead of one of the prescribed texts. This is because each school is going to choose a different text, and I don't want to unfairly disadvantage or advantage any one of you. So hopefully you're familiar with the film texts that I refer to. Let's have a look at the imaginative landscape. This is the question from the 2014 exam, which states, imagination shapes our response to the landscape. And this can be taken two ways. Either how we perceive the landscape is influenced and shaped by our imagination and preconceived ideas, or alternatively, when creating fictional landscapes, our imagination has free rein. Either of these can be acceptable, provided you back up your argument with evidence. So let's have a look at this in reference to the Hobbit trilogy, directed by Peter Jackson. You can clearly see in that film the landscape changes throughout as the protagonists get closer to the so-called desolation of Smaug. You never really think of villains living in meadows with nice little babbling brooks nearby. They're always left in dark castles with the curtain closed, or in this case, living in a mountain on a pile of gold. Why do we always think that? Because books and movies always show villains in this environment, in our context. An expository essay might look at that and compare a few different villains, or draw from personal experience. Even though none of us have battled dragons in huge mines, maybe you could talk about how that class that you hated at school had a classroom to match. Or your neighbour's horrible dog who always dug up their garden, and since you hated that dog, it seemed like it suited the environment. A short story might focus on a villain who actually has a really nice lair with a flat screen TV and lots of windows on the coast of Hawaii, a real James Bond style bad guy. Otherwise, maybe villains think that where they are is really nice, and that's why everyone keeps trying to invade. so that they can get out of their gross green homes filled with animals and live in a wonderful barren wasteland with no one to bother them. Whose reality? One person's reality might be completely different to someone else's, and so you need to talk about how each of them came into the mindset that they have and how it differs to anyone else's. So, if you can, try and bring in two sides of reality, which caused conflict in the text. A great movie for this one could be James Cameron's Avatar. Now you have Jake, who literally lives in two different realities. One where he's with his own and paralyzed body, and the other where he's a fully mobile body in a whole new world with a different species who considers him their own. The realities of the two opposing sides, with Jake in the middle, are very different, but neither of them is necessarily wrong. Yes, everyone is not on the side of the humans, but a more compelling essay would view both sides impartially, or better yet, discuss how the narration and direction influence the viewer to agree with their point of view. The 2014 exam question was misrepresenting reality can have serious consequences. You can bet that Jake lying to both sides caused a lot of conflict in the end and a lot of loss as well. Talk about the consequences of Jake's actions and perhaps how things might have gone differently if he hadn't lied. Additionally, make sure that you talk about how other characters and their misrepresentations of reality as well. Grace, Parker, and the Colonel all misrepresent reality at some point, and it's important to discuss this so that your essay has some variety in it to make it interesting. Creatively, you could write about the aftermath of the conflict from an unexpected party, or you could frame a short story around another oppressed Indigenous people, since the text obviously has strong ties to this, provided you focus upon the ideas of multiple points of view leading to a conflict. As long as there are clear references to the text and themes it discusses, you can be as creative as you like with this one. Your best bet is to make sure that your story revolves around some sort of reflection on whether your protagonist's reality is more important than anyone else's. Encountering conflict. The Hunger Games is a great example of conflict in film today. Often texts for this context involve literal conflict of some kind, but also a conflict of personal belief. While everyone is going to write about the conflict in the arena, maybe you could look more at the sacrifices which Katniss has to make in order to survive. There are really three levels of conflict: intrapersonal, interpersonal, and cultural, which also covers religious, social, and racial conflict. On the intrapersonal level, there's obviously the choices that Katniss has to make, including her required willingness to kill other tributes. Interpersonal conflict is manifested in the actual battle of the arena, but also in the conflict between Haymitch and Effie, or between Haymitch and Katniss, or really between Haymitch and anyone he meets. Finally, cultural conflict is the one which many students will overlook. This includes the treatment of the lower class districts by the capital, and the fact that some people are starving while other peoples make themselves sick so that they were able to eat more, and many other examples of unfair treatment of people that persuade throughout the series. All of these tie into the 2014 exam question, conflict causes harm to both the powerful and the powerless. If you are writing a short story, be sure to include references to the themes of Hunger Games as well. Maybe it's the favourite movie of your protagonist, and so they draw parallels between their situation and the series. Or maybe you can set it in the same universe, showing different points of view that can be useful too. I'm sure that at least some of the Capitol employees had doubts about what they were doing. Maybe write a short story about a technician on the games who secretly helps the tributes or hides items for them while building the arena. You don't have to set it in the same world as the Hunger Games, but the basis of your story must have the same themes as the text you're studying. Exploring issues of identity and belonging. If there was ever someone who struggled with the identity and belonging, it would be Elsa from Disney's Frozen. Don't say you haven't seen it, because I know you have. All her life, she's locked herself away, and when she finally opened up the doors, she had to find out exactly where she belonged. However, with a question like 2014's, discovering who we are and where we belong can be challenging. Isn't absolutely everyone going to talk about Elsa? To stand out, you should try and do something that's a bit different. That doesn't mean ignoring the central characters, but don't be afraid to focus on another character. Kristoff, Hans, and even Olaf all struggle with issues of identity and suddenly have to change their perspective after the adventure begins. An expository essay might also discuss the personal challenge you had to face, in which you can discuss the themes of family or isolation that show up in Frozen. Creatively, it's easy to think of stories which can inspire a narrative about adolescents who don't know where they belong, but so many creative pieces are going to use that angle. Why not try and think about something unique? Indigenous people adapting to Western life, or someone moving to a new country and being foreign to everything including the language. Even more topical, you could talk about refugees moving to new countries and having to decide whether to keep their old cultural identity or start fresh, and the various conflict that this brings with it. So as you can see, there are many angles you can take in your pieces. The hardest part about the context section is that it forces you to think broadly and holistically about the areas. That said, this also makes this section really open and free, and I strongly encourage you to actually get a sense of enjoyment out of writing in it. So that being said, your action for this video is to take one of the pieces that I mentioned in the episode and actually craft your response. Take whatever you thought stood out most and give it a go, and remember to plan it before you write. Once you're done with that response, join me for the next episode. Until then, my name's Raoul and this is Elevate English.